Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Labour Justice Barometer podcast. I'm Aisha Adam.
And I'm Debbie Collier.
And we're your hosts today on the Labour Justice Barometer. South Africa has close to 200,000 registered cooperatives, yet very few operate sustainably or create meaningful work. In this episode of the Labour Justice Barometer, we take a look at cooperatives as a form of enterprise and why cooperatives are struggling to fulfill their promise and what can actually be done about it. We're joined today by Dr. Shane Godfrey, an honorary research associate at the University of Cape Town and Centro Associate, who has recently co-authored a report on the state of cooperatives in South Africa to discuss his findings. We will also consider what it would take for cooperatives to play a more meaningful role in enterprise development and the world of work in South Africa. Before we get into the substance of the report, 2025 was the United Nations International Year of Cooperatives. Can you give us a brief overview of cooperatives, their potential benefits, and very briefly how they are regulated in South Africa?
Yeah, just to start with the basics, a co-op is, and I'm going to call them co-ops rather than the full cooperative, is an organization with an economic objective that is membership-based and operates according to democratic principles. And it's quite a unique form of organization. Unlike all other organizations that have an economic objective, a co-op is not for profit. The economic objective of a co-op is broadly to provide either services or employment to members rather than make a profit. Similarly, because it has an economic objective, it's different from a lot of other membership-based organizations that have that are run according to democratic principles. So it's quite a unique form of organizations. The variety that co-ops take is very wide. The current Co-ops Act of 2005 lists 9 types of co-op. I don't think that's a closed list. I think it's just a categorization that they're using. Housing co-op, agricultural co-op, financial services co-ops, marketing and supply co-ops, as well as worker co-ops and consumer co-ops. Most of these provide some sort of service to members that has an economic value, but the objective of the worker co-op is to provide employment to members. For obvious reasons, it is the worker co-op that has the most potential benefit in South Africa. Just to briefly mention that when we talk of co-ops, we're usually talking about primary co-ops, which is the bottom rung in a hierarchy of co-ops that go from primary to secondary co-ops. So a number of primary co-ops can come together and establish a secondary co-op that then usually will provide a range of services to the primary co-ops that are the members of the secondary co-ops. And a number of secondary co-ops can then also come together and establish a tertiary co-op, which similarly will provide a set of services to the secondary and through them the primary co-ops, often at that level being able to engage more with government. In terms of the potential benefits of co-ops, I think one needs to bear in mind the cooperative principles when one thinks about benefits. A key principle, obviously, is cooperation, but another is self-reliance or self-sufficiency. So it's really about the creativity and energy of members working together that sets cooperatives apart from other organizations. It's their solidarity and their reliance on each other and their cooperation with each other that is the key resource for a co-op. And it's the advantages that they need little else to get off the ground other than that solidarity and cooperation. The potential benefits when they do get off the ground are wide-ranging depending on the type of co-op. Employment in income-generating work in a worker co-op, as I've indicated, achieving lower input costs through bulk buying, which is the case often with agricultural co-ops, more negotiating power in markets with a range of co-ops, but again, agriculture in South Africa is a case in point, the ability to more easily access credit, achieving economies of scale, and so on. But also members themselves are empowered through their involvement in cooperatives, and often the communities that cooperatives are based in are empowered as well. So to come to how they're regulated in South Africa at the moment, first, just briefly to mention that South Africa has a long history of cooperatives. The first co-ops were registered in 1922, and obviously they're best known in South Africa for the apartheid period in the agricultural sector. In the post-apartheid period, a new co-ops policy was developed in 2004, and then a new act was introduced in 2005. Various changes have happened since then. A new policy, the Integrated Strategy on the Promotion and Development of Co-ops, was introduced in 2011. And then substantial amendments were made to the Act which were passed in 2013 but only came into effect in 2019, a rather puzzling 6-year delay for an important piece of legislation, or an important set of amendments. And the amendments were accompanied by a very substantial set of regulations. The Amendment Act is the key means of regulation currently. In terms of the administration of the Act, co-ops fall under the Department of Small Business Development, which also promotes small for-profit enterprises, with the Small Enterprise Development and Finance Agency the key instrument for providing services for small enterprises and co-ops. And the Registrar of Co-ops, however, is housed not in the Department of Small Business Development, but in the CIPC within the Department of Trade, Industry and Competitiveness. Just on this, before I end off, our perception is that co-ops are, in policy terms, really being subsumed within the small enterprise category. And they're starting to lose their identity, and the unique aspects of co-ops are not being recognized in programs and in policy. And the registrar being at arm's length in the CIPC is also problematic.
Shane, thanks for that comprehensive overview. And I'm going to take a step back as well now, and just to give our listeners some of the broader context around the report that you were asked to draft, and the project that we were concerned with, and maybe some of those issues that you are tapping into at the end of your description. They also indicate, where our project got stuck. But just for the broader context, and again, this information will be available in the report that's in the episode description. But our center at the university supported a group of an organization of domestic workers who had initially intended to explore the potential for using a cooperative as a mechanism for organizing. And as Shane mentioned, of course, the extent to which cooperatives can play an important role in organizing workers to provide opportunities for employment. But the project was a particularly ambitious one because it sought to engage not only with the concept of cooperatives for organizing workers, but also with the concept of platform and platform cooperatives. A platform being a digital platform, so to engage in the digital economy. And a good example of a domestic worker platform, but not a cooperative, is Sweep South. Some of our listeners will be familiar with Sweep South, and we'll leave a link as well in the episode description to Sweep South. But Sweep South, of course, is a for-profit organization in which domestic workers can find opportunities for work. This would have been a domestic-run platform cooperative. And our readers can read Shane's report around the extent to which forming a platform cooperative is a struggle in South Africa. So we're going to put aside the idea of platform cooperatives now, Shane, but just to pick up on your other findings in the report, and you've alluded to some of these, but perhaps if you can, delve into a little bit more information on government's track record in terms of implementing the legislation, but also, from our experience and how you disclose in the report, some of the potential for misuse of the cooperative form. And then perhaps if you can also, you've mentioned some of the sectors in which cooperatives do have potential, and perhaps if you can elaborate a little bit or just give some sense of what you found in your study.
Yes, sure. The core of the study really was an examination of the policy and the legislation. So I'll focus on that in responding to your questions. The legislation is not without its problem, but the 2005 Act was probably a relatively good base to enter the post-apartheid period in terms of developing cooperatives. But the 2005 Act did have certain problems. But probably the real the problems really were exacerbated with the 2013-2019 amendments. And I'm saying 2013-2019 because they were passed in 2013, but only implemented in 2019. And they, in broad terms, I can't go into the detail, they in broad terms have added unnecessary complexity to the Act. And as far as I can see, they've, in general, in the amendments, they resorted to over-regulating co-ops to make up for the lack of monitoring and enforcement capacity in the DSBD. And they also failed to address a number of issues in the original Act, for example, the way cooperatives are categorized, which they had the opportunity in the amendments to address. But leaving aside the legislation, what's on paper, the key weakness really has been the failure of government, and in particular, first the DTIC and then the Department of Small Business Development, to implement the legislation and to administer it effectively. A glaring example, and this is just one of many, is the introduction in the original Act of 2005 of the Co-ops Advisory Board. And this was not initially established. And then in the 2013 Amendment Act, it was repeated in the Act and renamed the Co-ops Advisory Council, but it's still not been implemented. So some 20 years, 21 years after it was first introduced and then again being reintroduced in the 2013 Act, it hasn't been implemented. And it's a potentially vital body that should have addressed shortfalls in policy and could have done it on an ongoing basis with respect to cooperative development. And there's never been any explanation as to why it's not been implemented to date. Along with that has been in the 2013 Amendment Act, 2 additional bodies were to be established: the Co-ops Development Agency and the Co-ops Tribunal. Neither of them have been established some 6 years after the Act was promulgated. And the co-ops, like the Advisory Council, the Co-ops Tribunal is arguably a critical instrument for adding some enforcement muscle to the promotion of co-ops. So again, this is a damaging failure on the part of the DSBD with respect to implementation of the legislation.
You're listening to the Labour Justice Barometer, and we'll be right back.
One aspect of the failure of the government or the DSBD to implement the legislation is the absence of monitoring and enforcement in respect of the Act, as I've alluded to. And this is interrelated with the failure to collect meaningful data on cooperative development, which is in turn linked to the problematic categorization of cooperatives, categories that actually overlap with each other. Is an agricultural co-op an agricultural co-op when it's at the same time a worker co-op? And how does one deal with that in the statistics? And how does one deal with that in the registration of the co-op? In effect, the Act and the legislation has made it relatively easy to register co-ops. While on the face of it, it's not an entirely simple procedure, it is just a paper exercise. And there's no oversight or monitoring or engagement with co-ops once registered, as far as we can see. Or if there is, it seems to be very, very limited. So one aspect of this is that almost no co-ops have been deregistered since the new Act was implemented, despite the fact that independent research points to a failure or attrition rate of about 88% of co-ops. 90% of them having failed after a certain amount of time. So there's a very small survival rate of about 10 to 12%. So of the currently about 200,000 registered primary co-ops, which is an enormous number, the research suggests that the vast majority of these co-ops no longer exist or are not operational. But in statistical terms or in official terms, there are 200,000 registered co-ops. That's the data that the DSBD has got to work with. The second aspect of the lack of monitoring and enforcement addresses your question about the potential misuse of the cooperative form. And that is, many co-ops are being registered that do not function in co-ops. Specifically, they do not function according to democratic principles. And the most glaring example, and the one that's received most of the publicity in this regard, is the conversion of clothing firms in KZN, particularly in and around Newcastle, into co-ops, from companies into co-ops, in order to take advantage of a loophole in the original Act that excluded worker co-ops from the ambit of the LRA and BCEA. So effectively, members of a worker co-op weren't covered by the LRA and BCEA, and a lot of unscrupulous clothing manufacturers saw that by converting to co-ops, they can avoid labor legislation, and in particular the bargaining council agreement, which is enabled via the LRA. So beyond meeting the basic requirements to register, these bogus co-ops didn't comply with most other aspects of the Act and did not function according to democratic principles. But rather than the DTIC or more recently the DSBD picking up this problem and then dealing with it, and they have the means within the Act to deal with it, it was left to the Clothing Bargaining Council that attempted to deal with it through litigation in first the Labour Court and then the Labour Appeal Court. And unfortunately, they were unsuccessful in both cases. Despite loophole then being closed in that 2013-2019 amendment, so in bringing worker co-ops within the ambit of the LRA and BCEA, these bogus co-ops continue to exist, continue to claim that they're co-ops, and continue to not comply with the BC agreement, with the Bargaining Council agreement and the LRA and the BCEA. And years later, the DSBD appears to have chosen to ignore this. Despite all these problems, co-ops do still have potential. And I think they, especially in certain sectors, they have more potential than others. Now, we did a tiny sample of case studies, so I want to underline that this is completely unrepresentative. But we tried to identify sectors that we thought co-ops have an advantage in, and thought we might find some relatively successful co-ops to use as case studies. And we focused on agriculture, and we ended up looking at sugarcane growers and also rooibos tea producers. And in both cases, we were focusing on small grower co-ops. We also looked at the fishing sector with a focus on small-scale fishing. We looked at a housing co-op, and then we looked at waste collection and recycling because we understood there were a number of initiatives happening in there. And as I said, we selected them based on some prior knowledge where there were co-ops and where they seemed to have a certain amount of momentum. And we found that there are co-ops that are surviving, often struggling, but still staying on their feet. What was particularly interesting is that in almost every case where there was a co-op that is relatively successful, it has had the support of another organization, either an NGO that has worked with it and supported it, or in the case of the cane grower co-ops, the SA Cane Growers Business Association has played a critical role. In respect of government, across almost all those co-ops, they've had no support from government, either because they haven't bothered reaching out to government, or they attempted to and didn't get any response from government in terms of getting support. The other model really that emerged from these sector case studies or co-op case studies was the small-scale fishing sector. And this revealed a very active involvement from government, but in a particular way. And it provided an example of a government using its control of a resource, in this case fishing quotas, as a lever to compel small-scale fishers to set themselves up in co-ops in order to access quotas. So they were given the opportunity to access quotas, but only if they established themselves in a primary co-op, and it's the primary co-op that's awarded the quota rather than individual fishers. It hasn't been an unqualified success across the entire sector, but certainly the particular primary set of primary co-ops who have already come together and established a secondary co-op is working very well, and certainly seem to be a shining example of what could be achieved more widely in the fishing sector, based on the policy that the Department of Fisheries and the Environment had introduced. And it also informed our thinking around a model that could be the basis for a viable co-op development strategy going forward. And that is a greater sectoral orientation to the strategy. So rather than focus in on sectors, then the current sort of provincial and local government devolution strategy that is in place. And within sectors, then the identification of levers or resources and incentives that government can use in sectors to promote, certainly the resource or the incentive to promote co-ops and give them a chance of becoming viable, rather than throwing money at them. And then supporting them via sectoral programs.
Just to follow off from that, you mentioned, registration of co-ops, misuse of the form of co-ops, monitoring and compliance, collecting data. So then, just for our listeners, what then needs to be done legally or institutionally for cooperatives to become a more viable strategy in enterprise development and to provide access to sustainable and decent work?
I think just to start with the legislation again, I mean, there are certain problems and certainly some amendments can be made, but that's definitely not where the major problem lies. It's primarily about the inability of government to implement legislation, through a coherent policy and with appropriate programs. So I think what I think is needed is a new policy that will ensure the effective implementation of the Act in full. The problem is if one starts now, and our understanding was that the Department of Small Business Development did seem to be at the start of some sort of new policy development phase, and it sent out a call for research for this. The problem is that it's going to be reliant on this to design a new policy on data about co-ops. And there's an almost complete absence of data, let alone really useful data about co-ops. So we know that there's about 200,000 co-ops presently. We know that probably only about 20,000 of them succeeded and have survived. Why the 180,000 failed, we don't know. Why the 20,000 are succeeding, we don't know. So there's just a massive absence of data that would be critical to inform the new policy. But even if one were able to wave a magic wand and get that data, it's not going to solve the problem. If the Department of Small Business Development doesn't build its capacity to monitor co-ops properly, to get data on them, to support them effectively, and then to enforce their legislation effectively as well, and to deregister co-ops that aren't actually functioning as co-ops. And they need, I think, a lot more political will, but as well, they need a lot more capacity. And they set up completely wrongly at the moment, as far as I can see. They can't do this from an office in Pretoria that is already somewhat detached from the office of the Registrar of Co-ops, which sits in the CIPC, in the DITC, sorry for all the acronyms. They have to get closer to the ground. At this point, the only CEDFA, which is the Development and Finance Agency, has people on the ground. And I suppose the Department of Small Business Development sees that as their mechanism for reaching people. But our impression, I mean, based on our small number of samples, but also some key informant interviews, suggests that the people they have on the ground are very, very thinly spread. So there definitely aren't enough people to effectively implement the legislation and, unpack all of that legislation for this unique type of organization, which has a lot of benefit, but at the same time isn't an easy organization to get working and to keep working and to get off the ground in particular. And I think what they've done so far is, because they sit in an office in Pretoria, they've attempted to design legislation that is actually trying to cover all the bases in the legislation on paper, and not introduced a more maybe streamlined and flexible form of legislation, and then rely more on people on the ground in terms of implementing that legislation and making sure that the organizations that are established are actually functioning as cooperatives. I mean, that's a tall order, but I think that's what has to actually be tackled.
That was incredibly insightful, and I think it speaks to legislation in a number of fields where we really are trying to tie up all loose ends in the legislation, but not actually putting boots on the ground. So perhaps the next question and our last question, which is how we always wrap up, is a bit unfair, given the extent of the insights and nuances that you've shared with us. But we usually end off to give an indicator on our constructed labor justice barometer scale, where green means that a state of play or an outcome or a development is very positive. Orange signals that much more needs to be done, but at least we can see a little bit of green, but a little bit of red. And then, of course, when we're in the red, it signals a major labor justice problem. So just to end off, Shane, where would you place the law on cooperatives and the state of play on cooperatives in its current state?
I think, unfortunately, I'd have to go with red. Maybe a few streaks of orange, but predominantly red. I think there's a long way to go to get cooperative development up and running effectively.
Thanks so much, Shane, for joining us today, and thanks to you and Jan Teron for the insights that you've shared in your report, and for the great studies that you've included in the report. And it's been great talking to you today. Thanks for joining us.
It's been a pleasure, Debbie, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to present some of our findings.
To our listeners and to our readers out there, more info on what Shane spoke to us today based on their report will be in our description, and with more information as well, we'll also leave their details. So if any of our listeners have any questions or want to ask for further engagement, we will leave both Shane and Jan's details as well. See you in the next one, Debbie.
See you, Asha.
This podcast is not intended to constitute legal advice.